This presentation is brought to you by Arizona State University's Julianne Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability and a generous investment by Julianne Wrigley.
So with regard to the anthropophilia, right, you have the human species and the human individual, so
right.
Kind of you could refer to one or the other. And so I think I read somewhere that some people attribute the Renaissance to the impact on the European human species of the Black Death. And
can everybody hear?
So,
yeah.
So with regard to, what's an ethical response to kind of the climate debate? Should we seek to postpone the catastrophe, in which case it will be really big, or should we seek to cause it to happen sooner so that it will be easier to manage?
This has come up many times in my conversations with people on these issues. Dan Schrag, who is now on PCAST, the president's Technology and Science Committee, and who's at Harvard. I guess I'd call him a polymath now on these issues. He's focused a lot on energy as well as on his climate history stuff. Years ago, I had a conversation with him which got to this question of there's two options facing climate to push the change you would need in emissions as we head toward 9 billion people seeking decent lives. One is to magically build public will to have a higher cost on carbon emissions, sufficient to drive everyone to change their habits and investments and technologies. The other is to push really hard on the technology. And those are two variables, and the pace with which we address carbon would be determined by the two. He's looking at that, and it's really pretty clear we're not going to do it with public will, especially when you realize that nearly all of the emissions that are coming, the new emissions, are coming in China and India, and they want energy. They're very happy for us to pay for getting the carbon out. And then you say, well, okay, we'll just innovate our way. He knows we're kind of not capable of that as well, and so what he says is the scientific and academic and intellectual community needs to have the plasticity to develop the toolkit and the intellectual capacity, what Bill Gates calls the communal IQ, kind of like, so that you're ready, so that you've got the capacity to ramp up in ways that can get at the problem as public will perhaps changes because of some of the clarity that would emerge amid all the frozen fountains in Phoenix, that this really is an issue. And I think he's got some, that's got some merits.
So playing off what Andy said, I think that what I would argue is that the constraints on climate change are very clear and very powerful, and most of what we propose to do essentially ignores the existing constraints. I mean, the Kyoto Protocol has not worked for 20 years. Geoengineering, even if we're stupid enough to implement it at scale, is not going to work the way we think it is. No powerful technology is only going to operate on one small part of the Earth's system. It just doesn't happen that way. That doesn't mean that we're hopeless, though. To use an example out of industry, when the Montreal Protocol was being discussed, the electronics industry in the United States was faced with having to get out of using CFCs at a fairly rapid time pace. We did so, and we did so because we had a lot of options on the shelf, a lot of technology options, some management options, some product redesign options, but there was a lot there. Wasn't used, wasn't commercialized, but it was available. So we got out pretty quickly. Then, because this is the way the Senate works, the Senate decided we ought to get out of lead in 2 years in solder. Couldn't do it. Didn't have the options. We had no technology that would substitute for lead-based solder in electronics. Certainly not at scale. Now, what that tells me is that if we really are serious about being ethical about climate change, I don't think you're going to stop the Kyoto process, so you might as well continue it. It's locked in right now. I think you want to do what you can to avoid geoengineering, certainly at scale. But you can certainly develop a lot of options that would give you the ability to adjust in ways that may have a portfolio of impacts that is manageable. And we don't do that. Let me give you an example of one sample technology. Meat in factories. For those of you that like the Dalai Lama, are omnivores, cows are a really, really ineffectual way of making steak. I mean, they are just not what an engineer would come up with. Cow produces 50 kilograms of methane a year. Cows are just really, really inefficient. So you make the meat in factories. Now, think about what that would do. That would mean that the land that we are now using for cattle, for pigs, for chicken, something like a third of the grain production in the world goes to produce meat. That would be freed up. That would give you an enormous area of land to be able to begin to do, for example, biofuels without doing serious damage to some of these other cycles. So factory-produced meat might be a really neat geoengineering technology. Now, some of you here probably run cattle, and your immediate response is, what the flip? It's actually not that, but this is being recorded. So the answer that this gives is a more realistic answer. Nothing we do is going to be without cost. So the question becomes how to balance the costs and benefits. In an option space with a portfolio approach, I think gives you the best opportunity to do it pragmatically. But we don't do that, particularly in climate, because the discussion's too polarized right now.
This presentation is brought to you by Arizona State University's Julianne Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability for educational and non-commercial use only.